The damp chill of a Seattle November has a way of sinking straight into your bones, bypassing the flesh entirely. For 19-year-old Skylar Bancroft, that cold was a constant, unforgiving companion. She wasn't on the streets by choice. She was a ghost in the city's margins, having fled a house of horrors in Portland 2 years prior when she was just 17 years old. Skylar possessed no grand dreams of saving the world. Her daily ambitions were strictly limited to finding a dry piece of cardboard, avoiding the roaming predators of the night, and securing at least one hot meal a day. She had set up her meager camp in a dead-end alleyway just off Yesler Way, hidden behind a towering green dumpster that shielded her from the biting wind coming off Puget Sound. The alley was her kingdom, a kingdom of cracked asphalt and graffiti-stained brick walls. But it was hers. In the 2 years since she had run, Skylar had learned the brutal mathematics of survival. Trust no one. Stay invisible. Never ever let your guard down. But it hadn't always been this way. Before the streets claimed her, Skylar Bancroft had been a different person entirely. She had been a student and honor roll kid who devoured books about engines and machinery. She had dreamed of becoming a mechanic, of understanding how things worked, of fixing what was broken. That dream felt like it belonged to someone else now, some naive girl who didn't yet understand that the world breaks people and never bothers to fix them. The foster home in Portland had shattered whatever innocence she had left. Marcus and Helen Crowley had seemed kind enough at first. The social worker had called them a godsend, a stable home for troubled youth. What the social worker didn't know, what nobody knew, was what happened behind the closed doors of that modest house on the corner of Burnside and 23rd. The Crowleys had 2 biological children and 3 foster kids, including Skylar. The biological children were treated like royalty. The foster children were treated like unpaid labor at best and punching bags at worst. Marcus Crowley Sr. was a large man with hands like hammers and a temper that ignited without warning. Helen was complicit in her silence, turning away every time her husband's voice rose, every time his fist came down. Skylar had endured it for 3 years. She had learned to make herself small to anticipate Marcus Sr.'s moods, to hide the bruises under long sleeves. She told herself she could survive until she turned 18. Then she could leave legally, could disappear into a life of her own making. But then there was Marcus Jr. Marcus Jr. was the Crowleys' youngest biological son, 14 years old, and already following in his father's footsteps. He had his father's cruelty, but lacked the restraint that came with age. One cold November night in 2023, Marcus Jr. had decided that one of the younger foster kids, a timid boy named David who was only 12, had stolen his phone. He hadn't. The phone had been in Marcus Jr.'s backpack the entire time. But facts didn't matter when rage took over. Skylar had been in her room, the tiny converted storage space in the basement that she shared with another foster girl. She had heard the shouting upstairs, heard David's terrified pleas. She had frozen her survival instincts, screaming at her to stay hidden, to not get involved. The sounds had escalated, furniture breaking, David screaming, then silence. When Skylar finally worked up the courage to creep upstairs, she found David at the bottom of the staircase, his neck bent at an impossible angle. Marcus Jr. stood over him, breathing hard, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. Marcus Sr. appeared moments later, taking in the scene with cold calculation. Skylar watched from the shadows as Marcus Sr. made a phone call. Not to 911, to someone else. Within an hour, men in suits had arrived. David's body was removed. The story was prepared. An accident. A tragic fall. David had always been clumsy, they would say. So sad. Such a troubled child. Skylar understood in that moment that if she stayed, she would either end up like David or become complicit in the lie. So that night, while the house slept, she packed a single backpack with clothes her mother's photograph and the $47 she had saved from odd jobs. She walked out the front door and never looked back. The first 6 months on the streets nearly killed her. She didn't know, the rules didn't know where it was safe to sleep or who could be trusted. She was robbed twice, assaulted once, and came within hours of freezing to death during a particularly brutal winter storm. But she survived. She learned. She found the alley off Yesler Way, and she made it work. Now, 2 years later, Skylar had $23 to her name. She kept it hidden in a Ziploc bag tucked deep into the lining of her worn jacket. It was everything she owned in the world, besides the clothes on her back, a stained sleeping bag, and the cardboard sheets that formed her shelter. On this particular Tuesday evening in November 2025, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of rain. Skylar sat behind her dumpster counting her money for the 100th time, as if the bills might somehow multiply if she just wished hard enough. $23? She needed 50 for a decent fake ID, the kind that might actually pass inspection at a legitimate business. With a fake ID, she could apply for real jobs. With a real job, she could rent a room somewhere. With a room, she could stop being invisible. It was a long chain of impossible ifs. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday. There was a soup kitchen 3 blocks away that served dinner at 6, but the line would be long and full of men who stared too long and stood too close. Skylar had learned to weigh hunger against safety and sometimes hunger lost. She was debating whether to risk it when she heard a familiar voice. "Skylar, honey, you back there?" Skylar's head snapped up. She recognized that voice. Mrs. Opal Hendricks, the elderly woman who ran the corner store 2 blocks down. Mrs. Hendricks was 72 years old, built like a fireplace with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. She was also the only person in Seattle who treated Skylar like a human being. "Back here, Mrs. Hendricks," Skylar called out, emerging from behind the dumpster. The old woman appeared at the mouth of the alley carrying a paper bag. She didn't smile exactly, but her expression was warm. "Thought I might find you here. Got some day-old bread and some soup, still hot." Skylar's eyes stung. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to. I wanted to." Mrs. Hendricks set the bag down on a relatively clean spot near the dumpster. "You eat that before it gets cold, you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am, thank you." Mrs. Hendricks studied her for a long moment. "You're a good kid, Skylar. I don't know what happened to put you out here, and I'm not asking. But you're smart and you're tough. One of these days, things are going to turn around for you." Skylar wanted to believe her. She really did. But 2 years on the streets had taught her that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Hendricks." The old woman nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Skylar, there's a job board at the library. They post positions that don't require too much paperwork. Might be worth looking into." "I will, thank you." After Mrs. Hendricks left, Skylar sat down and opened the bag. Inside was a container of vegetable soup still steaming and half a loaf of sourdough bread. It was the best meal she'd had in weeks. As she ate, she let herself imagine just for a moment what it would be like to have a normal life again. A job, an apartment, a place where she could lock the door and feel safe. Maybe even get back to school, somehow study mechanics like she'd always wanted. But those thoughts were dangerous. Hope hurt worse than hunger when it was crushed. She finished her meal, carefully sealed the container to save the rest for tomorrow, and settled back against the cold brick wall. The temperature was dropping. It was going to be a long night. What Skylar didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that her life was about to change forever. That in less than an hour, a broken-down motorcycle and a man called Iron would set into motion a series of events that would pull her out of the shadows and into a world she never imagined. The first sign was a sound, a deep rhythmic rumble that echoed off the buildings, growing louder with each passing second. It was a sound Skylar had heard before, the distinctive growl of a vintage motorcycle, but this one was different. This one sounded angry, like a mechanical beast fighting against its own mortality. Then came the sputtering. The engine coughed, choked, and finally died with a sound like a death rattle. Skylar peered around the edge of the dumpster. At the mouth of her alley, bathed in the weak amber glow of a single street lamp, was a mountain of a man wrestling with a massive motorcycle. He was trying to muscle it up onto its kickstand, cursing under his breath in a voice like gravel rolling around in a concrete mixer. The man was old, somewhere in his late 60s, with steel gray hair, pulled back in a ponytail, and a face carved with deep lines of weather and age. He wore heavy denim jeans, scuffed engineer boots, and a leather vest that bore an insignia Skylar didn't recognize. A winged skull with the words Hell's Angels arched above it and Washington curved below. Skylar shrank back behind the dumpster. She knew about the Hell's Angels, at least what the streets had taught her. They were dangerous, criminals, the kind of men you avoided at all costs. But this man didn't look particularly dangerous at the moment. He looked frustrated and tired. He had finally gotten the bike onto its stand and was now digging through a saddlebag, pulling out tools, and muttering a continuous stream of creative profanity. "Goddamn throttle cable. 42 years I've been riding and you picked tonight, you piece of shit. Of all the nights. The man pulled off his heavy leather gloves and massaged his left knee with a grimace. Even from her hiding spot, Skylar could see the slight hitch in his movements, the way he favored one leg over the other. She should stay hidden. That was the smart play. But something about the scene felt less threatening than pathetic. An old man alone in the rain, broken down in a bad part of town. Skylar watched as he spread tools out on the wet asphalt and knelt beside the engine. His hands shook slightly as he worked, and she could hear him grunt with pain as his knee protested the position. 20 minutes passed. The man made no progress. If anything, he seemed to be making things worse, fumbling with wrenches and muttering darker curses. Finally, he sat back on his heels, wiped grease from his forehead, and looked directly at the gap between the dumpster and the wall. "You can come out, kid. I ain't gonna bite, unless you got a spare half-inch wrench in your pocket." Skylar froze. How did he know she was there? When she didn't respond, the man sighed. "Look, I've been riding these streets for over 40 years. I know when someone's watching. And I could use an extra set of hands even if they're small ones. So either come out or don't, but I'm not going to hurt you." Something in his tone, a kind of bone-deep weariness that matched her own, made Skylar's decision for her. She pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders and stepped out from behind the dumpster. The man looked at her. Really looked at her in a way that made Skylar want to shrink back into the shadows. But his eyes weren't cruel or hungry like the eyes of most men who noticed her. They were measuring, assessing, but not in a predatory way. "Jesus," he muttered. "You're just a kid." "I'm 19, Skylar said defensively. "Like I said, a kid." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a crumpled bill, and held it out to her. It took Skylar a moment to realize it was a $100 bill. Her eyes went wide. "I can't take that." "Why the hell not? I didn't do anything to earn it." The man snorted something that might have been respect flickering across his weathered face. "Go get yourself a coffee. And a sandwich. Hell, get 3 sandwiches. You look like a stiff breeze would knock you into the harbor." Skylar stared at the money. It was more than she usually made begging in 3 weeks. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took it. "Thank you, sir." "Don't call me sir. I work for a living. Name's Iron. Arthur Gallagher, but everyone calls me Iron." "I'm Skylar." "Well, Skylar, unless you want to help me figure out why this bastard of a bike won't cooperate, I suggest you get going before the rain starts." Skylar hesitated. She should leave. Take the money and disappear before this strange old biker changed his mind. But something held her in place. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. Iron raised an eyebrow. "Throttle cable snapped. Need to replace it, but I'm too old and too damn arthritic to get the new one threaded properly." "Can I see?" Iron shrugged and gestured at the engine. Skylar approached cautiously, setting her sleeping bag aside. She had spent countless hours on YouTube, back when she had regular access to library computers, watching mechanical tutorials. Motorcycles weren't so different from cars, not in the basics. She looked at where Iron had been working at the tangle of cables and the frustrated mess he'd made of the replacement. She could see the problem immediately. He'd been trying to force the cable through from the wrong angle. "You need to come at it from the top," she said quietly. "If you try to push it through from below, it catches on that bracket." Iron stared at her. "You know bikes. I know engines, a little." "Well, hell, have at it then." Skylar's fingers were cold and stiff, but muscle memory took over. She had always been good with her hands, good at understanding how things fit together. Within 5 minutes, she had the new cable threaded and attached. "Try it now," she said, stepping back. Iron turned the key and gave the throttle a twist. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful. A grin split his weathered face. "I'll be damned, kid's got magic hands." He killed the engine and looked at Skylar with new respect. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "A YouTube and a lot of practice." "You got a place to stay tonight?" The question hung in the air. Skylar's defenses immediately went up. "I'm fine. That wasn't what I asked." "I've got a spot. I'm good." Iron was quiet for a long moment, and Skylar had the uncomfortable feeling he could see right through her lies. But he didn't push. Instead, he reached into his vest and pulled out a business card. "Ironclad Customs. That's our shop in Ballard. We do motorcycle work, custom builds. If you ever need a job, you come by and ask for me. Someone with your touch could make decent money." Skylar took the card, not quite believing what she was hearing. You serious? As a heart attack. Can't promise anything fancy, but we always need help in the shop. And you've got a gift. Be ashamed to waste it. Before Skylar could respond, a sound cut through the quiet of the alley. Harsh, mocking laughter. Male voices, multiple, echoing off the brick walls. Iron's expression changed instantly. The openness vanished, replaced by a cold wariness that made him look every inch the dangerous outlaw his vest proclaimed him to be. Three young men appeared at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the street lamp. They were clearly drunk, swaying on their feet, expensive clothes disheveled. Even from a distance, Skylar could smell the whiskey and entitlement rolling off them in waves. She recognized the type immediately. Rich kids, university dropouts. The kind who came down to this part of town looking for something or someone to break just because they could. Her blood ran cold. The one in front, tall, with perfectly styled hair and a designer trench coat, spotted her and grinned. It wasn't a friendly expression. Well, 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 look what we have here. His words slurred together as he stepped into the alley, his two friends flanking him like hyenas. A little street rat. Hey, rat, didn't the city say they were going to sweep this garbage up? Skylar immediately backed against the brick wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that look in his eyes. She'd seen it before. These weren't just drunk idiots. These were predators. Leave me alone, she whispered, hating how her voice cracked. The one on the left, shorter with mean eyes and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Skylar made in a month, laughed and stepped forward. He kicked at her cardboard shelter, scattering the carefully arranged pieces into the wet gutter. "Aw, look! Did we mess up your little house? What are you gonna do about it, rat?" Skylar's hands clenched into fists, but she knew better than to fight back. 3 against 1, and they were bigger, stronger, and too drunk to feel pain. She'd lose, and it would only make things worse. She was preparing to run when a single word cut through the alley like a gunshot. "Hey." It wasn't loud, but there was something in that voice, something ancient and absolutely unmovable, that made all three young men stop and turn. They had been so focused on Skylar that they'd completely ignored the man kneeling by the motorcycle in the shadows. Now Iron stood up slowly, grabbing a heavy steel wrench from his tool roll. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag, his eyes locked on the lead bully. "The lady told you to leave her alone." Iron said, his tone devoid of anger, entirely calm, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "So you're going to turn around, walk your preppy asses back to whatever frat house you crawled out of, and we're going to pretend this never happened." The leader, the one in the designer trench coat, puffed out his chest. He looked Iron up and down, saw an old man with gray hair and a limp, and completely failed to understand the significance of the death's head patch on Iron's back. "Who the hell are you, Grandpa, her pimp or something?" His name was Preston Vandermeer, though Skylar didn't know that yet. He was 23 years old, the son of Richard Vandermeer, CEO of Cascade Tech. He had been expelled from 3 universities, racked up over $200,000 in gambling debts, and had his trust fund cut off just 3 days prior. Preston was used to money solving his problems. When money didn't work, intimidation usually did. And when neither worked, violence had always been an acceptable fallback. He'd come down to Pioneer Square tonight with his friends Cole Ashford and Trent Morrison, specifically looking for someone weak to take his frustrations out on. Skylar was perfect, homeless, alone, invisible. What Preston didn't know was that the old man standing between him and his victim had spent 42 years in the Hells Angels, that he'd served in Korea and survived the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir, that he'd buried more friends than Preston had ever made, and that he'd learned a long time ago that true danger doesn't announce itself with swagger and expensive cologne. Iron sighed a deep, tired sound. "Boy, you are writing checks your body can't cash. Walk away." Preston's response was to lunge forward, his fist swinging in a wide, drunken arc. It was a terrible punch, slow telegraphed, fueled by whiskey and misplaced confidence. Iron didn't even bother to step back. He simply slipped to the side, moving with the kind of economy that comes from decades of experience, and drove a short, vicious hook into Preston's ribs. The crack of bone was audible even over the ambient noise of the city. Preston's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a soundless scream. Then he collapsed to the wet pavement, curling into a ball and gasping like a landed fish. For a moment, nobody moved. Cole and Trent stared at their leader writhing on the ground, their brains struggling to process what had just happened. Skylar pressed herself harder against the wall, torn between the urge to run and a strange compulsion to stay. Iron stood over Preston, wrench still in hand, waiting to see if the other two would be smart enough to cut their losses. They weren't. Iron's bad knee, the one that had been shattered by Chinese artillery fire 73 years ago, chose that exact moment to give out. He stumbled, catching himself against the brick wall, and in that instant of vulnerability, everything went wrong. Cole and Trent saw their opening. More importantly, they saw their friend on the ground, and whatever passed for loyalty in their alcohol-soaked brains kicked in. Trent, the tallest of the three, spotted a piece of discarded metal scaffolding pipe in a pile of construction debris near the dumpster. He grabbed it, the heavy steel cold in his hands, and as Iron tried to right himself, Trent swung with all his might. The pipe caught Iron across the back of the skull with a sound like a hammer hitting a watermelon. Iron's knees buckled. He pitched forward, hitting the asphalt face first. His leather vest scraped against the rough pavement. A pool of blood, black in the dim light, immediately began to spread beneath his gray hair. Skylar screamed. The sound tore out of her throat before she could stop it, raw and primal. She'd seen violence before, plenty of it, but this was different. This was a man who had stood up for her, who had treated her with kindness and respect, now lying motionless in a spreading pool of his own blood. Cole and Trent descended on Iron's fallen form like jackals. Their expensive boots slammed into his ribs, his back, his legs. Preston, recovering enough to stagger to his feet, despite the agony in his side, joined in. The three of them lost themselves in a frenzy of violence, kicking a motionless old man who could no longer defend himself. "Think you're tough, old man?" Preston spat between kicks, his face twisted with rage and pain. "You're nothing. You're trash, just like her." Skylar stood frozen, her back against the cold brick, every survival instinct she'd honed over 2 brutal years screaming at her to run. The alley was open behind her. She could vanish into the Seattle night, disappear into the labyrinth of streets and alleys she knew so well. Nobody would ever find her. Nobody would ever know she'd been here. The man on the ground was a stranger. He'd given her $100 and a business card, sure, but she owed him nothing. Survival meant looking out for yourself. It meant running when staying meant getting hurt. David's face flashed through her mind. Her foster brother lying at the bottom of those stairs, his neck bent at an impossible angle. She'd hidden in the shadows then, too afraid to help, too afraid to speak up. She'd run away and told herself it was survival. But what had that survival cost her? 2 years living like an animal, jumping at shadows, trusting no one. She'd survived, yes. But at what price? As Skylar watched the boots slam into Iron's unprotected body again and again, she felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, something else. Something that had been holding her together through pure stubbornness and fear. The fear evaporated, burned away by a desperate, blinding rage. She didn't make a conscious decision. Her body simply moved. "Stop it." Skylar didn't just yell. She launched her entire 90-pound frame through the air, arms outstretched, and tackled Cole Ashford around the waist. The impact sent them both crashing into the row of garbage cans with a tremendous clatter. Cole hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Preston and Trent spun around, shocked by the sudden assault. Skylar didn't try to fight them. She knew she couldn't win. She was 90 pounds of skin and bones against 3 men who outweighed her by at least 100 pounds each. Fighting them would be suicide. Instead, she threw herself directly over Iron's bleeding body. She landed hard, her knees hitting the asphalt, and wrapped herself around his head in a tight fetal position. Her arms cradled his skull, her body turning into a human shield against the onslaught she knew was coming. "Get off him, you filthy bitch!" Preston roared, grabbing the back of her jacket and trying to yank her away. Skylar anchored her fingers into Iron's leather vest and held on with every ounce of strength she possessed. She wouldn't move. She couldn't move. When Preston realized she wasn't going to budge, he released her jacket and drew his foot back. The first kick caught Skylar in the ribs. White-hot pain exploded through her side, so intense it drove the air from her lungs. She gasped, her vision swimming, but she didn't let go. Another kick landed on her shoulder, then her thigh, then her back. Skylar squeezed her eyes shut and bit down on her lips so hard she tasted copper. The pain was everywhere, a symphony of agony that threatened to overwhelm her completely. But beneath her, she could feel Iron's shallow breathing, could feel the slight rise and fall of his chest. He was still alive. That was all that mattered. Just hold on, she told herself. Just protect his head. Just a little longer. Beneath her, Iron drifted in and out of consciousness. His vision swam with red and black. His skull throbbed with a sickening, bone-deep agony that made thinking nearly impossible. Through the fog of his concussion, he became aware of impacts landing on something above him, of muffled groans of pain that weren't his own. The realization pierced through his haze like a spike of pure adrenaline. The girl, the kid was taking the beating meant for him. Iron's right arm was trapped beneath his body, pinned by Skylar's weight and his own. But his left hand was free, his fingers numb and clumsy but functional. He slid his hand slowly up the inside of his vest, reaching for the specialized inner pocket where he kept his phone. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have the strength for that. But he had something else, something that might save both of them if he could just manage to activate it. Iron's phone was custom programmed for exactly this kind of emergency. As a senior member of the club, he had a dedicated speed dial that connected directly to the clubhouse. All he had to do was press and hold a large button on the side. His thumb, slick with blood and barely responsive, found the button. He pressed it with the last of his fading strength. 5 miles away, inside a sprawling warehouse in Ballard that served as the Seattle Hells Angels clubhouse, the atmosphere was electric. Over 500 patch members from across the West Coast had gathered for a massive memorial run, and the air was thick with the smell of beer exhaust fumes and brotherhood. At the center of it all was James Sullivan, called Hammer by everyone who knew him. At 52 years old and 6'4", with a beard like a forest and eyes like flint, Hammer commanded respect simply by existing. As president of the Washington chapter, his word was law. He was in the middle of a story, something about a run through Montana back in the 80s, when his phone began to vibrate wildly on the oak bar. The screen flashed with a stark red skull icon. It was the emergency line, and it was Iron. Hammer's hand shot up, cutting off his own story mid-sentence. The effect was immediate. 500 conversations died instantly. When a chapter president raises his hand, you could hear a pin drop among outlaws. Hammer answered the phone and put it on speaker, holding it up so the room could hear. "Iron, where you at, brother?" There was no immediate answer. Instead, the clubhouse speakers picked up a symphony of horror. The sickening thud of boots striking flesh, a sharp, agonizing cry from a young woman, Preston Vandermeer's cruel, breathless laughter. "Look at this! The street rat thinks she's a hero." Then Iron's voice, barely a whisper, raspy and broken. "Yesler, Pioneer Square. They're killing the kid." The line went dead. Hammer's blood ran ice cold. His eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of every single member present. They all understood. One of their own was down. Someone was dying to protect him. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Hammer's voice erupted like thunder. "Mount up!" The roar that followed Hammer's command wasn't just noise. It was a physical force, a concussive wave of fury and brotherhood that rattled the corrugated steel walls of the warehouse. 500 men moved as one, a synchronized organism driven by a singular purpose. Chairs were kicked over, pool cues clattered to the concrete floor, beer bottles abandoned mid-drink. Every patch member in that building understood the code that had governed their lives for decades. When a brother falls, you ride. No questions, no hesitation. You ride. The massive roll-up bay doors screeched open, revealing rows upon rows of motorcycles parked in perfect formation. Chrome gleamed under the industrial lights. Leather creaked as men swung legs over seats they knew as well as their own skin. The first engine turned over with a guttural snarl, then another, then 10, then 100. Within 60 seconds, 500 heavy V-twin engines were firing up simultaneously inside an enclosed warehouse. The sound was apocalyptic, a mechanical earthquake that shook the foundations of every building within 3 blocks. Windows rattled in their frames. Car alarms triggered up and down the street. People stepped out of nearby bars and restaurants, looking around in confusion and growing alarm. Hammer was already on his bike, a matte black Road King that looked like it had been forged in the depths of hell. He didn't need to give orders. The club knew what to do. They'd practiced for this. Hoped they'd never need it, but they'd practiced. The formation rolled out of the warehouse like a tidal wave of steel and leather. Hammer took point, his bike's headlight cutting through the Seattle drizzle like a searchlight. Behind him, the chapter's road captain and sergeant-at-arms fell into position. Behind them, the rest followed in tight formation, 5 bikes wide, stretching back for blocks. They hit the streets at speed, running red lights without hesitation. Traffic scattered before them like leaves before a storm. Cars pulled over drivers, staring in shock and fear as the seemingly endless procession of motorcycles roared past. Hammer's mind was racing faster than his engine. Iron had said Yesler, Pioneer Square. That was 5 miles through city traffic. At normal speeds, it would take 15 minutes. Hammer intended to make it in 5. Behind him, his brothers followed without question. Some of them had ridden with Iron for decades. Others barely knew him. It didn't matter. The patch made them family. Family meant everything. In the alley off Yesler Way, Skylar's world had narrowed to a single point of focus. Survive the next second, then the next, then the next. She had lost count of the kicks. Her ribs felt like broken glass grinding against each other with every shallow breath. Her left arm had gone completely numb, either from the cold or from nerve damage. She couldn't tell anymore. Blood from her split lip dripped onto Iron's leather vest, mixing with his blood and the rainwater that had started to fall. But she didn't let go. Couldn't let go. Beneath her, Iron's breathing was getting shallower. She could feel it, the slight rise and fall of his chest becoming more irregular. She wanted to check on him to see if he was still conscious, but she didn't dare move her hands from where they protected his skull. Cole Ashford grabbed a handful of her hair and yanked backward, trying to peel her off Iron's body. The pain was excruciating, but Skylar just dug her fingers deeper into the leather vest and held on. Her scalp felt like it was on fire, but she'd endured worse. She could endure this. Stubborn bitch, Cole snarled, releasing her hair. Fine. You want to protect him? You can die with him. Trent Morrison still held the metal pipe, the one he'd used to cave in Iron's skull. Now he raised it again, his face flushed with exertion and alcohol, aiming for the back of Skylar's head. Preston Vandermeer, despite the agony of his broken ribs, felt a surge of savage satisfaction. This was going exactly the way he wanted. 2 problems, 1 solution. They dumped both bodies in Puget Sound, and by morning, this would all be a bad memory. Trent's arm came down in a vicious arc, but the pipe never connected. Trent froze mid-swing, his arm still raised, his face suddenly confused. Do you guys feel that? Preston stopped, chest heaving. Feel what? The ground, it's... They all felt it then. A vibration coming up through the asphalt, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. The puddles on the ground began to ripple, small circles forming and expanding. Loose pebbles jumped and danced across the pavement as if possessed. It started as a low hum, barely audible over the ambient noise of the city, but it grew and grew, compounding on itself, building into a deep guttural roar that seemed to swallow all other sound. The brick walls of the alley began to vibrate. Skylar could feel it against her back, a rhythmic thrumming that matched no natural phenomenon she'd ever experienced. Preston's eyes went wide. His brain, fogged by alcohol and adrenaline, tried to make sense of what was happening. Earthquake. But Trent was shaking his head, the pipe slipping from his nerveless fingers. It hit the ground with a clang that was immediately swallowed by the growing thunder. That's not an earthquake. The sound continued to build, impossibly loud now, a mechanical symphony of rage and retribution. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the skyscrapers of downtown Seattle, bouncing between buildings until it seemed like the entire city was screaming. Cole was the first to look toward the mouth of the alley. What he saw made his bladder release warm urine running down his leg unnoticed. The amber streetlight that had illuminated Iron's broken-down motorcycle was now joined by others. Dozens of others. Hundreds of others. Headlights bright and unforgiving, creating a wall of light that stretched from sidewalk to sidewalk, blocking the entire street. And behind those headlights, emerging from the rain-slicked darkness, like demons from the pit, came the motorcycles. They filled Yesler Way completely 5 wide and stretching back as far as the eye could see. Chrome and steel and leather all rolling forward in perfect synchronization. The headlights created a solid wall of illumination, turning night into day shadows into stark relief. Preston's mouth went dry. His broken ribs, forgotten, his drunken swagger evaporated like morning mist. He took a stumbling step backward, his expensive shoes slipping in the wet blood on the ground. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The motorcycles rolled to a stop, forming an impenetrable wall across the entrance to the alley. The engines continued to idle, that massive collective growl that vibrated in the teeth, in the chest, and the very soul. Then, as if controlled by a single mind, every rider hit their kill switch simultaneously. The sudden silence was more oppressive than the noise had been. It pressed down on the alley like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, impossible to think. In that silence, a new sound emerged. The heavy, methodical crunch of leather boots on wet gravel. Not hurried, not panicked. The sound of men who knew exactly what they were doing and had all the time in the world to do it. Dozens of massive figures dismounted from their bikes. In the glare of the headlights, their shadows stretched long and dark across the pavement. Each one wore the same leather vest, the same winged death's head patch, the same bottom rocker that proclaimed their territory. Washington. They moved with military precision, forming a perimeter that sealed off not just the alley, but the entire block. Escape routes that Preston hadn't even considered were cut off before he could think to use them. These men had done this before, many times. Trent Morrison fell to his knees in the spreading puddle of water and blood and urine, openly weeping. His expensive khakis were soaked, his polo shirt torn. He'd lost one of his designer loafers in the scuffle. He looked like exactly what he was. A spoiled child playing at violence, suddenly confronted with the real thing. Cole stood frozen against the brick wall, his back pressed so hard against the rough surface that he could feel individual bricks digging into his spine. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his mind retreating into some safer place where this wasn't happening. Preston tried to hold on to some shred of his earlier bravado. His father was Richard Vandermeer, CEO of Cascade Tech, a man who owned buildings and politicians and judges, a man who made problems disappear. Surely that had to count for something. The wall of bikers parted and a man walked through. He was enormous, 6'4" at least, built like something that belonged on a battlefield rather than a city street. His leather vest was worn and weathered, adorned with patches that told stories of decades on the road. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with gray, but it was his eyes that truly terrified Preston. They were absolutely cold, not angry, not enraged, just cold and calculating, like a butcher evaluating cattle. This was Hammer Sullivan, and he walked down that alley like he owned it. Like he owned the entire city, like he owned the night itself. He didn't look at Preston or his friends. Not yet. First, he walked to the center of the alley where Iron lay motionless, and Skylar remained curled protectively over him. Hammer knelt slowly, his massive frame somehow gentle as he reached out. He placed two thick fingers against the side of Iron's neck, feeling for a pulse. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then Hammer exhaled slowly. He's alive. A murmur ran through the assembled bikers. Relief, anger, and something darker all mixed together. Hammer moved his hand to check Skylar's pulse next. She was conscious, barely, her eyes squeezed shut and her body trembling with pain and exhaustion and shock. But she was breathing steadily. "You can let go now, kid," Hammer said softly. His voice, when not raised in command, was surprisingly gentle. "We've got him." Skylar's eyes opened, unfocused and confused. She looked up at this massive, bearded stranger kneeling beside her and tried to process what was happening. The fear in her eyes was visceral. "You're safe," Hammer told her. "Both of you. You did good. You can let go now." Slowly, as if her muscles had forgotten how to obey her, Skylar released her death grip on Iron's vest. Her fingers were white and bloodless, the knuckles scraped raw. Hammer carefully lifted her off Iron's body and set her gently to the side, propping her against the wall. Two other bikers immediately moved in, one of them carrying a medical bag. This was Doc Miller, the club's medic, a former Navy corpsman who'd seen more trauma than most ER doctors. He went to work on Iron with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, stabilizing his neck, applying pressure to the head wound. Another biker, younger but no less capable, knelt beside Skylar and started a quick assessment. "Possible broken ribs, severe bruising, mild concussion," he reported. "She needs a hospital, but she'll make it." Only after his people were being cared for did Hammer finally turn his attention to Preston, Cole, and Trent. He stood slowly, rising to his full impressive height, and the temperature in the alley seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Which one of you?" Hammer asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying perfectly in the silence. "Swung the pipe." Nobody answered. Trent was crying too hard to speak. Cole had his eyes closed, possibly praying, possibly just trying to will himself into non-existence. Preston was staring at Hammer with the dawning realization that his father's money might not be enough to save him this time. Hammer's gaze settled on Trent, still on his knees, the discarded pipe lying on the ground beside him. "You," Hammer said. It wasn't a question. Trent's only response was a choked sob. Hammer looked at Preston next, taking in the expensive clothes, the manicured appearance, even in his disheveled state, the entitled posture that even terror couldn't quite erase. "And you're the ringleader. I can always tell. You've got that look, the one that says you've never been told no in your entire life." Preston's throat worked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he managed to force words out. "Listen to me." His voice cracked on the first word, but he pushed through, clinging to the only lifeline he'd ever known. "You don't want to do this. You have no idea who I am. My father is Richard Vandermeer. He's the CEO of Cascade Tech. He owns half the real estate in this city." Preston was gaining momentum now, his lawyer-trained brain grasping at straws. "If you touch us, he will bury your entire club in federal lawsuits. You'll all rot in prison. But if you let us go right now, we can forget this ever happened. I can make it worth your while. Money, whatever you want." Hammer listened to this speech with the patience of a man who had heard it all before. When Preston finally ran out of words, Hammer smiled. It was the most terrifying expression Preston had ever seen. "Cascade Tech," Hammer repeated softly as if tasting the words. "Yeah, I know Richard Vandermeer. I know he routes his offshore accounts through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. A shell corporation set up by a lawyer who just happens to be on our payroll." Preston's face went pale. "I also know," Hammer continued, "that your daddy has a fondness for high-stakes poker games in Tacoma. Unregulated games. Games that we run. In fact, if memory serves, he owes us somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million. The shield of wealth and power that Preston had clutched his entire life shattered into a million pieces. "Your daddy can't save you," Hammer said, stepping forward until his massive shadow engulfed Preston completely. "Because right now you're not dealing with lawyers or judges or politicians. You're dealing with the Hells Angels, and you just tried to beat an elder of our chapter to death in the street." Hammer looked down at Skylar, still slumped against the wall, her face bruised and bloody, her breathing labored. "Worse. You made a 19-year-old girl with nothing to her name take that beating for him. A girl who threw herself over a stranger to protect him while you three pieces of shit tried to kill them both." Hammer pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and hit dial. He put it on speaker. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Richard Vandermeer." "Richard, this is Hammer Sullivan." There was a pause. "Mr. Sullivan, to what do I owe the pleasure at this hour? Your boy Preston just tried to kill Iron Gallagher. Beat him with a pipe, left him bleeding in an alley. A homeless kid threw herself over Iron to protect him. Preston and his buddies beat her too. She's got broken ribs and God knows what else." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Is Iron alive?" Richard finally asked. "Barely. Doc's working on him now." Another pause. "And Preston, right here, asking me to let him go because his daddy's rich and powerful." Richard Vandermeer's sigh was audible even through the phone's small speaker. "Mr. Sullivan, 3 days ago, I cut my son off completely. Froze his accounts, revoked his credit cards, had him removed from my will. He has been nothing but a disappointment and an embarrassment to my family for years. I told him he needed to make his own way in the world." Preston's eyes went wider than seemed physically possible. Dad, please." "It appears," Richard continued as if his son hadn't spoken, "that the lesson hasn't taken. Do what your code requires, Mr. Sullivan. As far as I'm concerned, I have no son." The line went dead. Preston's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees beside Trent, all the fight draining out of him in an instant. His entire world, the foundation upon which his identity rested, had just evaporated in a 30-second phone call. Hammer pocketed his phone and gestured to the men standing behind him. "You used your hands and feet to inflict pain on people who couldn't fight back," Hammer said, his voice carrying to every biker present. "Club code says you lose the use of those tools." 10 patched members stepped forward. These weren't just any members. These were the chapter's enforcers, men who'd been doing this kind of work for decades. Men who knew exactly how much force was required to break bone without causing fatal damage. Preston found his voice one last time. Wait, please, I'll pay you whatever you want. I have money saved investments I can... You're gonna pay, said a massive biker they called Chains, his voice like grinding gears. Just not with money. What happened next took exactly 5 minutes and 17 seconds. The Hells Angels don't kill for revenge. Dead bodies bring federal heat investigation RICO charges. Hammer was too smart a president to allow that. But the club has always believed in proportional justice. An eye for an eye, a hand for a hand. Several bikes at the mouth of the alley revved their engines, the roar strategically timed to drown out the sounds of what was happening deeper in the shadows. It was practiced, efficient, mechanical. Doc Miller, working on iron, didn't even look up. He'd seen this before. He didn't approve, didn't disapprove. It simply was. The medic attending to Skylar gently turned her face away. Don't look, kid. Just keep your eyes on me, okay? Skylar, fighting to stay conscious, could still hear the muffled screams beneath the engine noise. Could still hear the distinct crack of bone breaking with surgical precision. Hands, feet, kneecaps. She should have felt horror, should have felt revulsion, but all she felt was a distant, numb satisfaction. These men had tried to kill iron, had tried to kill her. Whatever was happening to them now, they'd earned it. When it was over, Preston, Cole, and Trent lay in the mud, writhing but alive. Their hands and kneecaps had been systematically, brutally broken. They would survive. They would recover after a fashion. But they would never throw a punch or kick another human being for the rest of their lives. Hammer knelt beside Preston one last time. You're going to remember this night every time you try to hold a fork or climb a set of stairs. You're going to remember that girl who had nothing but still had more courage than you'll ever possess. And you're going to thank whatever God you believe in that I'm feeling merciful tonight. He stood and walked back to where Doc Miller was loading iron onto a stretcher. How is he? Severe concussion, possible skull fracture, broken ribs. He needs surgery, and he needs it now. The girl, 3 broken ribs, internal bruising, possible kidney damage. She needs a hospital too. A large black van had pulled up behind the wall of motorcycles. It was unmarked, windowless, and equipped with medical equipment that would make most ambulances jealous. This was how the club handled injuries they didn't want on official records. Doc and his team loaded both Iron and Skylar into the back. Skylar tried to protest, tried to say she couldn't afford a hospital, but Doc just shook his head. Don't worry about money, kid. You're family now. We take care of family. Skylar's vision was starting to fade, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Hammer's face, weathered and hard, but not unkind, looking down at her. You did good, Skylar Bancroft, he said. Real good. Now rest, we've got you. As the van doors closed, Hammer turned to address his assembled brothers. Escort formation. Every bike. We're taking over these streets until our people are safe at Harborview. I don't care about traffic laws. I don't care about cops. Anyone tries to stop us, they go through all of us. 500 bikers mounted their machines in unison. 500 engines roared back to life, creating a sound like the end of the world. The black van pulled out, and the motorcycles formed a massive, impenetrable phalanx around it. They took over every lane of the street, running red lights, forcing traffic to a complete standstill. Police cars appeared at intersections, lights flashing, but the officers inside took one look at the sheer number of bikers and called for backup instead of intervening. This wasn't a situation any cop wanted to handle alone. The convoy rolled through downtown Seattle like an invading army, unstoppable and uncompromising. Pedestrians stopped to stare. People pulled out phones to record. The sight of 500 Hells Angels moving with single-minded purpose was something most people only saw in movies. But for the 2 people in the back of that van, unconscious and bleeding, it was salvation. Inside the van, Doc Miller worked with steady hands, keeping Iron's vitals stable, monitoring Skylar's breathing. He'd been a corpsman in the Navy, had seen combat in the first Gulf War, and nothing much rattled him anymore. But even he had to admit what that girl had done was something special. 90 pounds, soaking wet, homeless and alone, and she'd thrown herself into a fight against 3 grown men to protect a stranger. That wasn't just courage. That was something else, something rare. The Hells Angels might be outlaws, might be criminals in the eyes of the law, but they recognized honor when they saw it. And that girl had more honor in her battered body than most people accumulated in a lifetime. The convoy reached Harborview Medical Center in 7 minutes flat. The emergency room entrance was usually a scene of controlled chaos, but when 500 motorcycles pulled up simultaneously, the chaos became uncontrolled very quickly. Hammer was off his bike before it fully stopped striding toward the ER entrance. Two orderlies with a gurney were already coming out summoned by Doc's call ahead. Too critical, Doc barked jumping out of the van. Head trauma and possible internal bleeding for the male, broken ribs and kidney damage for the female. Both need immediate assessment. The orderlies took one look at the wall of bikers surrounding the van and decided this wasn't the time to ask questions about insurance or proper procedures. Iron was loaded onto one gurney, Skylar onto another, and both were rushed inside. Hammer followed, flanked by a dozen of his most senior members. The ER staff tensed, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden influx of intimidating figures in leather vests, but nobody tried to stop them. The attending physician, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with kind eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, took one look at Iron's injuries and immediately called for a neurosurgeon. "He's critical but stable," she told Hammer after a quick examination. "We need to operate to relieve pressure on his brain. The sooner the better." "Do it," Hammer said without hesitation. "Whatever he needs, money's not an issue." The doctor nodded and turned to check on Skylar. The girl was conscious now, barely, her eyes unfocused and confused. Where am I?" Skylar's voice was barely a whisper. "Harborview Medical Center," the doctor said gently. "You're safe. You've got some broken ribs and internal bruising, but you're going to be okay. Can you tell me your name?" Skylar Bancroft." "Okay, Skylar. Do you have any family we should contact? Anyone who should know you're here?" Skylar's laugh was bitter and ended in a grimace of pain. "No family. No one." The doctor glanced at Hammer, who stepped forward. "She's got family now," he said firmly. "We'll handle everything. You just make sure she's taken care of." Over the next several hours, Harborview's ER became an unofficial Hells Angels waiting room. Bikers filled every available chair, lined the hallways, even spilled out into the parking lot. They were quiet, respectful, but their presence was impossible to ignore. Hospital security considered asking them to leave, but wisely decided against it. The club wasn't causing trouble. They were just waiting for their brother and the girl who'd saved him. Iron went into surgery at 11:47 p.m. The neurosurgeon Dr. Patricia Laurent spent 3 hours relieving the pressure on his brain and repairing the damage. It was delicate work made more difficult by Iron's age and the severity of his injuries. But Dr. Laurent was one of the best in her field, and by 2:30 a.m. she emerged to tell Hammer that the surgery had been successful. "He's stable," she reported, still in her surgical scrubs. "The next 72 hours are critical, but if he makes it through that window without complications, his prognosis is good. He'll need extensive rehabilitation, and he may never fully recover his motor functions, but he should survive." Hammer felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Skylar's treatment was less dramatic but no less important. X-rays confirmed 3 broken ribs and severe bruising, but no organ damage. She was given pain medication, her ribs were wrapped, and she was admitted for observation. By 3 a.m., both patients were stable and sleeping in adjacent rooms. Hammer stationed 2 members outside each door, then gathered the rest of his chapter in the parking lot. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying in the pre-dawn darkness, "tonight we were reminded what this patch means. Iron went down protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. A girl with nothing gave everything to save him. That's the code. That's what we're about." 500 heads nodded in agreement. Those 3 pieces of shit who did this will never walk right again. Never use their hands properly again. They'll spend the rest of their lives as crippled reminders of what happens when you cross the Hells Angels. A rumble of approval rolled through the crowd. "But more importantly," Hammer continued, "we gained something tonight. We gained a sister. That girl in there, Skylar Bancroft, she's one of us now. She proved it in that alley. So when she wakes up, when she's recovered, we're going to give her what she needs. A home, a job, a family. Because that's what we do. We take care of our own." The response was unanimous and immediate. 500 voices raised in agreement, a sound that echoed across the hospital campus and into the Seattle night. They were the Hells Angels. They were brotherhood made manifest, and they had just witnessed something that reminded them why they wore the patch in the first place. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor was the first thing Skylar registered, a steady mechanical pulse that seemed to echo in her skull. She tried to take a deep breath, but a sharp stabbing pain in her right side stopped her short. Her eyes flew open with a gasp. White ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights turned down low, the antiseptic smell of a hospital. Panic gripped her chest and she tried to sit up, tried to orient herself, tried to remember where she was and how she'd gotten here. The movement sent lightning bolts of agony through her torso and she fell back against the pillows with a choked cry. "Easy, kid. Don't fight the tape. You got 3 cracked ribs." Skylar turned her head slowly, careful not to jar anything that might hurt. In a leather recliner beside her hospital bed sat Arthur Iron Gallagher. He looked like he'd been through a war. A massive white bandage was wrapped around his head, his left eye swollen completely shut and ringed with purple and black bruising. His arm was in a sling, and even sitting still, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone in considerable pain. But his one good eye was sharp, watching her with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Memory flooded back in a rush. The alley, the 3 men, the beating, the boots, the blood. Skylar's hands instinctively went to her face, expecting to find it destroyed, but her fingers met only bandages and minor cuts. "You're at Harborview Medical Center," Iron said, his gravel voice surprisingly gentle. "Been here about 36 hours. You've been in and out, mostly out. Pain meds are pretty strong." Skylar tried to process this. 36 hours. She'd lost a day and a half. "Those men," she managed to whisper. "Preston and his friends. Are they—" "Dealt with," Iron said flatly. The finality in his voice left absolutely no room for follow-up questions. "They won't ever bother you or anyone else again. That's all you need to know." Silence fell over the sterile hospital room. Skylar could hear the heart monitor, the distant sound of nurses in the hallway, the mechanical hum of medical equipment. Normal sounds, safe sounds, so different from the chaos of that alley. "Why are you here?" The question came out smaller than Skylar intended. "I thought you'd be gone. Thought you'd just forget about me." Iron let out a dry chuckle that ended in a wince. He pressed a hand to his ribs. "Kid, you threw your 90-pound self over a patched Hell's Angel to take a beating meant for him. You have any idea what that means to men like me?" Skylar shook her head slightly, immediately regretting it when pain spiked behind her eyes. "In our world, loyalty is the only currency that matters. Blood is blood, but shedding yours for a stranger." Iron leaned forward as much as his injuries would allow. "That's something else entirely. You saved my life in that alley, Skylar. I was drifting in and out, but I felt you covering me. Heard you taking those hits. You could have run, should have run, but you didn't. You—" Tears burned hot in Skylar's eyes, the first real tears she'd allowed herself in months. I couldn't watch them hurt you anymore. You were the only person who looked at me like I was a human being in 2 years. The only one who didn't look through me like I was invisible." Iron's expression softened, a rare sight for a man who'd spent 42 years as an outlaw. He reached out with his good hand and gently patted her arm. "You reminded me of someone," he said quietly. "My daughter Samantha. You're about the same age she was when I lost her. She had your eyes, that same look of someone who'd been hurt too much too young." "What happened to her?" Skylar asked. "Overdose. 5 years ago. She was 24. Iron's voice was steady, but Skylar could hear the ocean of grief beneath it. "I was too focused on the club on the road, on being a brother instead of a father. By the time I realized I was losing her, it was too late. She was already gone, even before her heart stopped." "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." Iron was quiet for a moment. "When I saw you in that alley, when you stood between me and those bastards, it was like Samantha was giving me a second chance. A chance to do right by someone who needed protection, who needed family. You gave me that chance, Skylar. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." Before Skylar could respond, the door to her room swung open. James Hammer Sullivan ducked his massive frame through the doorway, holding a clipboard and a brown paper bag. Even in the sterile hospital environment, he looked like something carved from granite and leather. "We know everything about you, Skylar Bancroft," Hammer said without preamble, walking to the foot of her bed. "We know about the foster home in Portland. We know about Marcus and Helen Crowley. We know why you ran. We know you've been living behind that dumpster for 6 months." Skylar's breath caught. She felt completely exposed, like every secret she'd been carrying had been laid bare. "How?" "We have resources," Hammer said simply. "When one of our own goes down, we find out everything about the situation. That includes the people involved." Skylar shrank back against her pillows, her mind racing. "Are you going to send me back, turn me into social services?" Hammer's expression was unreadable. Then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but genuine amusement. "Hell no. Why would we do that?" He tossed the clipboard onto Skylar's bed. She picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the document. It was a lease agreement for a one-bedroom apartment in Ballard. The rent line showed an amount paid in full for the next 5 years. "That's yours," Hammer said. "Keys are in the bag along with a uniform." Skylar stared at the paper, unable to make sense of what she was seeing. "I don't understand." "It's simple. You start Monday at Ironclad Customs. That's our shop. You'll manage parts inventory, help with basic maintenance, sweep the floors. Do good work. Iron will teach you how to turn a wrench properly. Do great work. You'll have a career." "I can't take this." Skylar's voice was barely audible. "I don't have any money to pay you back." Iron leaned closer, his one good eye locking onto hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "You already paid, Skylar. You paid in the alley, with your blood and your bones and your courage. That's worth more than any amount of money." He reached into his leather vest, moving carefully around his injuries, and pulled out a small silver necklace. Hanging from the chain was a medallion bearing the club's winged death's head insignia. Stamped deeply into the metal below the skull were the words, "Protected by." Iron leaned over the bed rail and with surprising gentleness clasped the necklace around Skylar's neck. The medallion was heavier than it looked, warm from being close to Iron's body. "You wear that," Iron told her, his voice thick with emotion. "Anyone on the street gives you a hard time, they see that, they walk away. You're not a ghost anymore, kid. You're not invisible. You're family." Skylar's hands went to the medallion, her fingers tracing the raised skull. For the first time in 2 years, she felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Safety, belonging, hope. She broke down completely, sobs racking her damaged ribs, making each breath agony. But she didn't care. She cried for the scared 17-year-old who'd run from Portland. She cried for the 2 years of survival and fear. She cried for David, who never got a second chance. And she cried for the future that had suddenly, impossibly appeared before her. Iron awkwardly patted her shoulder while she cried, clearly uncomfortable with emotional displays, but refusing to leave. Hammer stood at the foot of the bed, his massive arms crossed, his expression softer than his appearance would suggest. When Skylar finally got herself under control, she wiped her eyes and looked at both men. "I won't let you down," she said. "I promise. I'll work harder than anyone. I'll prove I'm worth this." "You already proved it," Hammer said firmly. "In that alley, everything else is just details." Over the next 3 days, Skylar remained in the hospital while her body began the slow process of healing. The broken ribs would take weeks to fully mend, and the bruising that covered most of her torso made even simple movements excruciating. But she was alive. More than alive. For the first time in years, she had a reason to heal. Iron was in the room next to hers, recovering from his own surgery. The neurosurgeon had successfully relieved the pressure on his brain, but the road to recovery would be long. He faced months of physical therapy, and there was no guarantee he'd ever regain full function of his left side. But he was alive too. And like Skylar, he had a reason to fight. They spent hours together, Skylar in her bed and Iron in his chair, wheeled between rooms by nurses who'd stopped questioning the arrangement. He told her stories about his 42 years with the Hells Angels. The runs across the country, the brothers he'd lost, the code that governed their lives. In turn, Skylar told him about her life before the streets. Her parents who'd died in a car accident when she was 12. The foster system that was supposed to protect her but had failed spectacularly. Her dreams of becoming a mechanic, of understanding how things worked and fixing what was broken. "That dream doesn't have to stay a dream," Iron told her on the third day, his voice stronger now. as the swelling in his brain decreased. You've got natural talent. I saw it when you fixed my throttle cable. That kind of mechanical intuition can't be taught. It's either there or it isn't. And you've got it. You really think so? I know so. Give yourself 6 months at the shop. Learn the basics, get your hands dirty, prove yourself to the crew. Then we'll talk about getting you into a real training program. Maybe even get you certified. Skylar felt hope bloom in her chest, fragile but real. I'd like that. On the fourth day, the doctors cleared both of them for discharge. Iron would need outpatient therapy and regular check-ins, but he was stable. Skylar's ribs were still broken, but they would heal on their own with rest and care. Hammer arrived at noon with clothes for both of them. For Skylar, he'd brought jeans, a warm flannel shirt, and a leather jacket that was clearly new, but made to look worn. The ironclad Customs logo was embroidered on the back. "Welcome to the team," Hammer said as he handed her the jacket. Skylar slipped it on the leather, still stiff, but already feeling like armor, like belonging. A van was waiting outside the hospital, the same black van that had brought them in 4 days earlier. Doc Miller was driving, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile when he saw them. "Looking better than when I last saw you," he said. "Both of you." The drive to Ballard took 20 minutes through midday Seattle traffic. Skylar pressed her face to the window, watching the city roll by. It was the same city she'd been surviving in for 2 years, but it looked different now. Less hostile, less like a predator waiting to devour her. The apartment Hammer had secured was in a converted warehouse building 3 blocks from Ironclad Customs. It was small but clean with large windows that let in plenty of light. The furniture was minimal but functional. A bed, a couch, a small kitchen table. To Skylar, it looked like a palace. "It's not much," Hammer said, watching her take it in. "But it's yours, no strings, no expectations except that you show up to work on time and put in an honest day's effort." "It's perfect," Skylar whispered, running her hand along the back of the couch. "It's more than perfect." Hammer showed her how to work the locks where the laundry was in the building and left her with his phone number. "You need anything, you call, day or night. That's what family does." After he left, Skylar stood in the center of her apartment and simply breathed. Her own space, her own door with her own lock. Safety. She walked to the bedroom and lay down on the bed, careful of her ribs. The mattress was soft, the sheets clean and fresh. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept on an actual bed. For the first time in 2 years, Skylar Bancroft slept without fear. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Skylar woke before her alarm, nervous energy making sleep impossible. She dressed in the work clothes Hammer had provided, laced up the steel-toed boots that had been left by her door, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at her was familiar but different. The bruises from the alley were fading to yellow and green. The split lip had healed. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. They weren't dead anymore. They weren't just surviving. She touched the medallion around her neck, feeling its weight. Protected by. Ironclad Customs was a sprawling shop that took up half a city block. The main garage had space for a dozen motorcycles in various states of repair. The air smelled like oil and metal and possibility. When Skylar walked through the door at 7 a.m. sharp, she found Iron already there, leaning against a workbench with a cup of coffee. His head was still bandaged, but he'd traded the hospital gown for his usual denim and leather. "You're early," he said approvingly. "Good, shows you're serious." Over the next several hours, Iron introduced Skylar to the crew. There was Chains, the massive enforcer from the alley, who grunted a greeting and went back to rebuilding a carburetor. Doc Miller, who ran the shop's books when he wasn't patching up injured bikers. A younger member named Spider, barely 25, who specialized in custom paint jobs. And a dozen others, each one a patched member of the Hells Angels, each one treating Skylar with a respect that still felt surreal. Her first task was inventory. Iron walked her through the parts room, showing her how to catalog and organize the thousands of components they kept in stock. It was tedious work, but Skylar attacked it with a focus that impressed everyone watching. By lunch, she'd reorganized an entire section that had been a mess for months. Kids got a system, Chains observed, watching her work. Alphabetical by manufacturer, then by part number. Clean. Iron smiled. Told you she was smart. As the days turned into weeks, Skylar fell into a rhythm. Wake up in her apartment, walk the 3 blocks to the shop, work hard for 8 hours, learn everything she could, go home, sleep, repeat. But it wasn't monotonous. Every day brought new challenges, new skills to master. Iron was a patient teacher showing her how to properly torque bolts, how to read engine sounds, how to diagnose problems by feel as much as by sight. Mechanics is part science, part art, he told her one afternoon as they worked on a vintage shovelhead. The science you can learn from books. The art comes from experience, from getting your hands dirty and making mistakes and learning what works. Skylar absorbed everything like a sponge. She made mistakes, plenty of them, but she learned from each one. And slowly she began to earn the respect of the crew, not because of what she'd done in the alley, but because of the quality of her work. 6 weeks after starting at Ironclad, Skylar was given her first solo project. A customer had brought in a bike with electrical issues, mysterious problems that had stumped two other mechanics. Iron handed her the work order. "Think you can figure it out?" Skylar felt a flutter of nervousness but nodded. "I can try." It took her 4 hours, but she tracked down a corroded ground wire that was causing intermittent failures throughout the electrical system. When she fired up the bike and everything worked perfectly, the entire shop heard her whoop of triumph. Iron walked over, checked her work, and nodded approvingly. "Clean diagnosis, good repair. You just earned yourself a raise." That night, Skylar treated herself to takeout from a real restaurant instead of the cheap frozen meals she'd been subsisting on. As she ate in her apartment, she looked around at her space, at the life she was building, and felt something she'd almost forgotten: pride. 3 months after the alley, Skylar took her GED exam at the Seattle Public Library. She'd been studying in her free time using materials Iron had bought for her. When the results came back 2 weeks later, showing she'd passed with high marks, Iron took her out to celebrate. They went to a quiet diner, just the two of them, and over coffee and pie, Iron laid out a plan. "There's a technical college in Renton that has one of the best automotive programs in the state. 2-year degree, hands-on training certifications in everything from basic maintenance to advanced diagnostics." Skylar's heart started racing. "That sounds expensive." "It is. Tuition's about $20,000 for the full program." Iron pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. "Which is why I'm paying for it." "Iron, I can't let you." "Yes, you can. This is an investment, Skylar. In you and your future. You've got more raw talent than anyone I've seen in 42 years of turning wrenches. But talent only takes you so far. You need training credentials, a piece of paper that says you know what you're doing." "I'll pay you back," Skylar said firmly. "Every penny, I promise." Iron waved a hand dismissively. "You can try, but I'm not holding my breath. Just consider it a gift from a proud father to a daughter who's making him believe in second chances." The word daughter hung in the air between them. Iron had never said it so directly before. Skylar felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Thank you," she managed. "For everything. For believing in me when nobody else did. For giving me a chance." "You earned it, kid. Every bit of it." Spring arrived in Seattle with unusual force, washing away the gray drizzle and replacing it with brilliant sunshine. The city transformed almost overnight, cherry blossoms, blooming in parks, people emerging from their winter hibernation. Ironclad Customs had its garage doors rolled wide open, classic rock blaring from the shop speakers. The sound of tools and engines and masculine laughter filled the space. Skylar stood by a hydraulic lift, her hands stained with engine grease, carefully wiping down the chrome exhaust of a custom chopper. She'd been at the shop for 6 months now, and the transformation was complete. She'd gained healthy weight, her posture was straight and confident, and the hollow, haunted look that had defined her for so long was gone. In its place was the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. She wore her work uniform with pride, the Ironclad Customs logo visible on her jacket. The medallion Iron had given her hung outside her shirt, catching the sunlight. She no longer tried to hide it. Let people see. Let them know she was protected. Across the shop, Chains was teaching her how to properly balance a wheel. Spider was showing her a new pinstriping technique. Doc was going over the week's schedule, making sure she understood her assignments. This was her life now. Real, stable, full of purpose. A familiar rumble interrupted the music, and Skylar looked up to see Iron pulling his 1947 knucklehead into the shop. The bike was running perfectly now, all repairs completed, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Iron killed the engine, kicked down the stand, and dismounted with only a slight hitch in his gait. The knee still bothered him, probably always would, but he'd regained most of his mobility through sheer stubborn determination. The bandages were long gone, replaced by a pale scar above his left eye. Badge of honor from the alley. "Hey, kid," Iron called out, tossing her a half-inch wrench. "Stop polishing and come help me adjust this carburetor. You're riding with us to the coast this weekend." Skylar caught the wrench effortlessly, a grin spreading across her face. "Where on the coast, Seaside, Oregon? There's someone I want you to meet." The drive down the coast was everything Skylar had imagined and more. 50 motorcycles strong, the club made the trip in formation, Iron and Skylar riding together on his knucklehead. She sat behind him, arms wrapped around his waist, the wind whipping through her hair, the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly to their left. It was freedom in its purest form. They reached Seaside just after noon, the small coastal town quiet and peaceful. Iron led them not to a bar or a rally point, but to a small cemetery on the edge of town overlooking the ocean. He parked the bike and helped Skylar off. Together they walked through rows of headstones until Iron stopped in front of one. Samantha Rose Gallagher, 1995 to 2019. Beloved daughter forever in our hearts. Iron knelt slowly, his bad knee protesting, and placed a bouquet of white roses at the base of the stone. Skylar knelt beside him, her own flowers in hand. Iron had told her on the drive that white roses had been Samantha's favorite. "Samantha," Iron said quietly, his weathered hand resting on the cold marble. "I want you to meet someone. This is Skylar, your sister." Skylar placed her roses next to Iron's, her throat tight with emotion. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me," Iron continued, his voice rough. "I know I failed you, but this time I'm doing it right. This time I'm being the father I should have been. And I wanted you to know that. Wanted you to meet her." Skylar reached out and took Iron's hand, squeezing gently. "I'll take care of him," she said, to the stone, to the memory, to the sister she'd never met. "I promise." They stayed for a while, sitting in comfortable silence, the sound of the ocean providing a peaceful backdrop. When they finally stood to leave, Iron pulled Skylar into a careful hug, mindful of her still healing ribs. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For giving an old man a reason to keep going. For reminding me what matters. For being the daughter I lost and found all at once." They rode back to the rest of the club, where a celebration was already underway. Food was being grilled, beer was flowing, and the atmosphere was one of pure brotherhood. But before joining them, Iron had one more thing to show Skylar. He led her back to the knucklehead and gestured to the seat. "Your turn to drive." Skylar's eyes went wide. "You serious?" "As a heart attack. You've been watching me ride for 6 months. You've studied the mechanics. Time to put it together." With Iron's patient guidance, Skylar learned the feel of the clutch, the balance of the massive machine, the precise throttle control required. She stalled out twice, nearly dropped the bike once, but Iron never lost patience. "Easy, feel it. The bike will tell you what it needs." On her 4th try, everything clicked. The engine growled to life, the bike responded to her touch, and suddenly Skylar was riding. Actually riding. The wind in her face, the power between her legs, the freedom of the open road. She circled the parking lot once, then twice, her confidence growing with each revolution. When she finally brought the bike back to where Iron stood watching, she was grinning so hard her face hurt. "How was it?" Iron asked, though the answer was obvious on her face. "That was amazing. That was the most amazing thing I've ever felt." "Good, because that bike's going to be yours one day. When you're ready, when you've earned it. But it'll be yours." Skylar dismounted and threw her arms around Iron, not caring about his injuries or her ribs, just pure, unfiltered joy and gratitude. "Thank you. For everything. For saving me. For giving me a life." Iron returned the hug, his own eyes suspiciously damp. "You saved me first, kid. Don't ever forget that." As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the club gathered for a group photo. 50 bikers, leather and chrome and brotherhood, with Skylar right in the center. Iron on one side, Hammer on the other. She belonged here. Completely and totally. That night, lying in a motel room with the ocean waves providing a gentle soundtrack, Skylar reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From that alley, from those desperate moments when she'd chosen to stay instead of run to this moment of peace and belonging. She touched the medallion around her neck, feeling its familiar weight, protected by. But it meant more than that now. It meant family. It meant home. It meant a future that stretched out before her, full of possibility instead of fear. 6 months later, Skylar Bancroft enrolled at Renton Technical College, starting her formal training in automotive technology. She worked at Ironclad 3 days a week and attended classes 4 days a week, her schedule packed but manageable. Iron attended her first day waiting outside the classroom like any proud father would. When she emerged 3 hours later, excited and energized, he took her out for ice cream to celebrate. How was it? Incredible. The instructor said I have a natural aptitude, that I think like a mechanic. Told you, Iron said smugly. As for Preston, Vandermeer, Cole Ashford, and Trent Morrison, their fates unfolded exactly as Hammer had predicted. Preston's father had indeed cut him off completely, and with his hands permanently damaged, he struggled to find any employment. He ended up in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, walking with a cane, bitter and broken. Cole and Trent had fled Washington entirely terrified of the Hells Angels' reach. Last anyone heard, they were living in different states, looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows. And Richard Vandermeer found himself under federal investigation for tax evasion and fraud after a mysterious leak of his offshore financial documents. The source of the leak was never discovered, but anyone familiar with the Hells Angels' capabilities could make an educated guess. Justice had been served, not through the courts or the police, but through the iron code of men who valued loyalty above all else. 2 years after that night in the alley, Skylar stood in the center of ironclad customs, surrounded by her crew, her family wearing her graduation cap and gown. She'd completed her associate's degree with honors, earning certifications in diesel mechanics, electrical systems, and custom fabrication. Iron stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his pride evident on his weathered face. Speech, Chains called out, and the rest of the crew took up the chant. Speech, speech, speech. Skylar laughed and held up her hands for quiet. When the room settled, she took a breath. 3 years ago, I was invisible. I was surviving, but not living. I had given up on ever being anything more than a ghost in the margins. And then one night, an old biker's motorcycle broke down in my alley. She looked at Iron, her eyes bright. He gave me $100 and told me to get a sandwich. Such a small thing, but it was the first time in 2 years someone had seen me as a person. And when 3 men tried to hurt him, I couldn't just watch. I couldn't be invisible anymore. The room was silent, every eye on her. What I learned that night is that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up. It's about protecting each other. It's about loyalty and honor and giving a damn about someone other than yourself. You all showed me that. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me purpose when I had given up. You made me family when I thought I'd lost that forever. She raised her diploma. This piece of paper says I'm qualified to be a mechanic. But what really qualifies me is what you all taught me. How to work hard. How to never give up. How to be part of something bigger than myself. Skylar's voice cracked slightly. So thank you, all of you, for seeing me, for saving me, for making me part of the Iron family. The applause was deafening, echoing off the metal walls of the shop. Iron pulled her into a hug, and soon the entire crew was surrounding them, celebrating not just her graduation, but everything she represented. Hope, redemption, second chances. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Skylar and Iron sat outside on the shop's front steps, watching the sunset over Seattle. You know what the best part is? Iron said quietly. What? Samantha would have liked you. You remind me of who she could have been if things had gone differently. I wish I could have known her. In a way you do. She's the reason I was in that alley. I was coming back from visiting her grave. If my bike hadn't broken down in that exact spot at that exact time, we never would have met. Skylar considered this. So she brought us together. In a way, yeah. Like she was giving me one last gift. A chance to do right by someone who needed it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on as darkness fell. What's next for you? Iron finally asked. Well, I've been thinking. There's an advanced certification program in custom fabrication. Takes another year, but when you're done, you can design and build bikes from scratch. You want to be a builder? I want to be the best builder. I want to create something that will last, something people will remember. Iron smiled. Then that's what you'll do, and I'll be there every step of the way. Skylar leaned her head on his shoulder, careful of his old injuries. Thank you, Dad. It was the first time she'd called him that. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Iron's arm tightened around her. Thank you, daughter. 5 years after that night in the alley, Ironclad Customs expanded into a second location. The new shop specialized in custom builds, and Skylar Bancroft ran it. At 24 years old, she was one of the most sought-after custom bike builders in the Pacific Northwest. Her designs were distinctive, blending classic aesthetics with modern engineering. Each bike she built was a work of art, functional sculpture that honored the tradition of motorcycle culture while pushing it forward. She still wore the medallion Iron had given her, though she didn't need its protection anymore. She wore it because it reminded her of where she came from and who she'd become. Iron, now 73 and officially retired from riding, spent most of his time at the new shop consulting on builds and mentoring younger mechanics the way he'd mentored Skylar. His hair was completely white now, his movements slower, but his mind was sharp as ever. On a cool October morning, Skylar unveiled her latest creation at a regional bike show. It was a custom chopper built on a vintage frame, every component either restored or fabricated by hand. The paint was a deep metallic blue that seemed to shift in the light, and the chrome work was flawless. But what made it special was the dedication plate on the tank. The Samantha, built in memory of Samantha Rose Gallagher by her sister Skylar Bancroft. 2029. When Iron saw it, he didn't say anything. He just pulled Skylar into a hug and held on for a long time. The bike won Best in Show. When Skylar accepted the trophy, she dedicated it to Iron, to the Hells Angels who'd become her family, and to every person who'd ever felt invisible and found their way home. That evening, the club threw a celebration at the original Ironclad location. Hundreds of people showed up, members and friends and customers whose lives had been touched by the shop and the people who ran it. Hammer, now in his late 50s but still imposing as ever, raised a toast. To Skylar Bancroft, who proved that family isn't about where you come from, but where you're going and who's willing to go there with you. To the bravest 90-pound guardian we've ever known. To family. To family, the crowd roared back. Skylar stood in the center of that room, surrounded by love and acceptance and belonging, and realized that the scared 19-year-old girl who'd hidden behind a dumpster was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, who had fought for her place in the world, who had built something lasting from the ashes of her past. She thought about that November night 5 years ago, about the choice she'd made to stay instead of run, to protect instead of hide. It had been the scariest moment of her life, but it had also been the moment everything changed. Because sometimes salvation comes not from being saved, but from choosing to save someone else. Sometimes family finds you in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the most broken people can build the most beautiful things. Skylar raised her own glass, looking at Iron across the room. He smiled at her, that rare, genuine smile that she'd come to treasure. She smiled back, touching the medallion at her throat. Protected by family, saved by love, free at last.